The Madonna by Clive Barker. Read for you by Blackman. Jerry Colquhoun waited on the steps of the Leopold Road swimming pools for over 35 minutes before Garvey turned up, his feet steadily losing feeling as the cold crept up through the soles of his shoes. The time would come, he reassured himself, when he'd be the one to leave people waiting. Indeed, such prerogative might not be so far away if he could persuade Ezra Garvey to invest in the Pleasure Dome. It would require an appetite for risk and substantial assets, but his contacts had assured him that Garvey, whatever his reputation, possessed both in abundance. The source of the man's money was not an issue in the proceedings, or so Jerry had persuaded himself. Many a nicer plutocrat had turned the project down flat in the last 6 months. In such circumstances, fineness of feeling was a luxury he could scarcely afford. He was not at all that surprised by the reluctance of investors. These were difficult times, and risks were not to be undertaken lightly. More, it took a measure of imagination, a faculty not overabundant amongst the moneyed he'd met, to see the pools transformed into the gleaming amenity complex he envisaged. But his researchers had convinced him that in an era like this, where houses once teetering on demolition were being bought up and refurbished by a generation of middle-class Cyberites, that in such an era, the facilities he had planned could scarcely fail to make money. There was a further inducement. The council, who owned the pools, was eager to offload the property as speedily as possible. It had debtors aplenty. Jerry's bribee at the Directorate of Community Services, the same man who'd happily filched the keys to the property for 2 bottles of gin, had told him that the building could be purchased for a song if the offer was made swiftly. It was all a question of good timing. A skill, apparently, which Garvey lacked. By the time he arrived, the numbness had spread north to Jerry's knees, and his temper had worn thin. He made no show of it, however, as Garvey got out of his chauffeur-driven Rover and came up the steps. Jerry had only spoken to him by telephone and had expected a larger man, but despite the lack of stature, there was no doubting Garvey's authority. It was there in the plain look of appraisal he gave Colquhoun, in the joyless features, in the immaculate suit. The pair shook hands. "It's good to see you, Mr. Garvey." The man nodded, but returned no pleasantry. Jerry, eager to be out of the cold, opened the front door and led the way inside. "I've only got 10 minutes, Garvey said. "Fine," Jerry replied. "I just wanted to show you the layout." "You've surveyed the place?" "Of course." This was a lie. Jerry had been over the building the previous August, courtesy of a contact in the architects department, and had, since that time, looked at the place from the outside several times. But it had been 5 months since he'd actually stepped into the building. He hoped accelerating decay had not taken an unshakable hold since then. They stepped into the vestibule. It smelled damp, but not overpoweringly so. "There's no electricity on," he explained. "We have to go by torchlight." He fished the heavy-duty torch from his pocket and trained the beam on the inner door. It was padlocked. He stared at the lock, dumbfounded. If this door had been locked last time he was here, he didn't remember. He tried the single key he'd been given, knowing before he put it to the lock that the two were hopelessly mismatched. He cursed under his breath, quickly skipping through the options available. Either he and Garvey about turned and left the pools to its secrets, if mildew, creeping rot, and a roof that was within an ace of surrender could be classed as secrets, or else he made an attempt to break in. He glanced at Garvey, who had taken a prodigious cigar from his inside pocket and was stroking the end with a flame. Velvet smoke billowed. "I'm sorry about the delay," he said. "It happens," Garvey returned, clearly unperturbed. "I think strong-arm tactics may be called for," Jerry said, feeling out the other man's response to a break-in. "Suits me." Jerry quickly rooted around the darkened vestibule for an implement. In the ticket booth he found a metal-legged stool. Hoisting it out of the booth, he crossed back to the door, aware of Garvey's amused but benign gaze upon him, and, using one of the legs as a lever, broke a shackle of the padlock. The lock clattered to the tiled floor. "Open sesame," he murmured with some satisfaction, and pushed the door open, for Garvey. The sound of the falling lock seemed still to linger in the deserted corridors when they stepped through, its din receding towards a sigh as it diminished. The interior looked more inhospitable than Jerry had remembered. The fitful daylight that fell through the mildewed panes of the skylights along the corridor was blue-grey, the light and that which it fell upon vying in dreariness. Once, no doubt, the Leopold Road pools had been a showcase of deco design, of shining tiles and cunning mosaics worked into floor and wall, but not in Jerry's adult life, certainly. The tiles underfoot had long since lifted with the damp. Along the walls they had fallen in their hundreds, leaving patterns of white ceramic and dark plaster like some vast and clueless crossword puzzle. The air of destitution was so profound that Jerry had half a mind to give up his attempt at selling the project to Garvey on the spot. Surely there was no hope of a sale here, even at the ludicrously low asking price. But Garvey seemed more engaged than Jerry had allowed. He was already stalking down the corridor, puffing on his cigar and grunting to himself as he went. It could be no more than morbid curiosity, Jerry felt, that took the developer deeper into this echoing mausoleum. And yet, it's atmospheric. The place has possibilities, Garvey said. I don't have much of a reputation as a philanthropist, Colquhoun, you must know that, but I've got a taste for some of the finer things. He had paused in front of a mosaic depicting a nondescript mythological scene, fish, nymphs and sea gods at play. He grunted appreciatively, describing the sinuous line of the design with the wet end of his cigar. "Oh, you don't see craftsmanship like that nowadays," he commented. Jerry thought it was unremarkable, but said, "Oh, it's superb. Show me the rest." The complex had once boasted a host of facilities: sauna rooms, Turkish baths, thermal baths, in addition to the 2 pools. These various areas were connected by a warren of passageways which, unlike the main corridor, had no skylights. Torchlight had to suffice here. Dark or no, Garvey wanted to see all of the public areas. The 10 minutes he had warned were his limit, stretched into 20 and 30. The exploration constantly brought to a halt as he discovered some new felicity to comment upon. Jerry listened with feigned comprehension. He found the man's enthusiasm for the decor confounding. "I'd like to see the pools now," Garvey announced when they'd made a thorough investigation of the subordinate amenities. Dutifully, Jerry led the way through the labyrinth towards the 2 pools. In a small corridor a little way from the Turkish baths, Garvey said, "Hush." Jerry stopped walking. "What?" "I heard a voice." Jerry listened, the torch beam splashing off the tiles threw a pale luminescence around them, which drained the blood from Garvey's features. I don't hear—" "I said hush," Garvey snapped. He moved his head to and fro, slowly. Jerry could hear nothing. Neither now could Garvey. He shrugged and pulled on his cigar. It had gone out, killed by the damp air. "Trick of the corridors," Jerry said. "The echoes in this place are misleading. Sometimes you hear your own footsteps coming back to meet you." Garvey grunted again. The grunt seemed to be his most valued part of speech. "I did hear something," he said, clearly not satisfied with Jerry's explanation. He listened again. The corridors were pin-drop hushed. It was not even possible to hear the traffic in Leopold Road. At last, Garvey seemed content. "Lead on," he said. Jerry did just that, though the route to the pools was by no means clear to him. They took several wrong turnings, winding their way through a mass of identical corridors before they reached their intended destination. "It's warm," said Garvey, as they stood outside of the smaller of the 2 pools. Jerry murmured his agreement. In his eagerness to reach the pools, he had not noticed the steadily escalating temperature. But now that he stood still, he could feel a film of sweat on his body. The air was humid, and smelt not of damp and mildew, as elsewhere in the building, but of a sicklier, almost opulent scent. He hoped Garvey, cocooned in the smoke of his relit cigar, could not share the smell. It was far from pleasant. "The heating's on," Garvey said. "It certainly seems like it," Jerry returned, though he couldn't think why. Perhaps the department engineers warmed the heating system through once in a while to keep it in working order. In which case, were they in the bowels of the building somewhere? Perhaps Garvey had heard voices. He mentally constructed a line of explanation should their paths cross. "The pools," he said, and pulled open one of the double doors. The skylight here was even dirtier than those in the main corridor. Precious little light illuminated the scene. Garvey was not to be thwarted, however. He stepped through the door and crossed to the lip of the pool. There was little to see. The surfaces here were covered with several years' growth of mould. On the bottom of the pool, barely discernible beneath the algae, a design had been worked into the tiles. A bright fisheye gleamed up at them, perfectly thoughtless. "I always had a fear of water," Garvey said ruminatively as he stared into the drained pool. "Don't know where it comes from." "Childhood?" Jerry ventured. "I don't think so," the other replied. "My wife says it's the womb." "The womb?" "I didn't like swimming around in there, she says," he replied, with a smile that might have been at his own expense, but was more likely at that of his wife. A short sound came to meet them across the empty expanse of the pool, as of something falling. Garvey froze. "You hear that?" he said. "There's somebody in here." His voice had suddenly risen half an octave. "Rats," Jerry replied. He wished to avoid an encounter with the engineers if possible. Difficult questions might well be asked. "Give me the torch," Garvey said, snatching it from Jerry's hand. He scanned the opposite side of the pool with the beam. It lit a series of dressing rooms and an open door that led out of the pool. Nothing moved. "I don't like vermin," Garvey said. The place has been neglected," Jerry replied. "Especially the human variety." Garvey thrust the torch back into Jerry's hands. "I've got enemies, Mr. Colquhoun. But then you've done your researches on me, haven't you? You know I'm no lily white." Garvey's concern about the noises he thought he'd heard now made unpalatable sense. It wasn't rats he was afraid of, but grievous bodily harm. "I think I should be going," he said. "Show me the other pool and we'll be away." "Surely." Jerry was as happy to be going as his guest. The incident had raised his temperature. The sweat came profusely now, trickling down the back of his neck. His sinuses ached. He led Garvey across the hallway to the door of the larger pool and pulled. The door refused him. "Problem?" "It must be locked from the inside." "Is there another way in?" "I think so. Do you want me to go around the back?" Garvey glanced at his watch. 2 minutes, he said. "I've got appointments." Garvey watched Colquhoun disappear down the darkened corridor, the torchlight running on ahead of him. He didn't like the man. He was too closely shaven, and his shoes were Italian. But, the proposer aside, the project had some merit. Garvey liked the pools and their adjuncts, the uniformity of their design, the banality of their decorations. Unlike many, he found institutions reassuring. Hospitals, schools, even prisons. They smacked of social order. They soothed that part of him, fearful of chaos. Better a world too organised, than one not organised enough. Again his cigar had gone out. He put it between his teeth and lit a match. As the first flare died, he caught an inkling sight of a naked girl in the corridor ahead, watching him. The glimpse was momentary, but when the match dropped from his fingers and the light failed, she appeared in his mind's eye, perfectly remembered. She was young, 15 at the most, and her body full. The sweat on her skin lent her such sensuality she might have stepped from his dream life. Dropping his stale cigar, he rummaged for another match and struck it. But in the meagre seconds of darkness, the child beauty had gone, leaving only the traces of her sweet body scent on the air. "Girl?" he said. The sight of her nudity and the shock in her eyes made him eager for her. "Girl?" The flame of the second match failed to penetrate more than a yard or two down the corridor. "Are you there?" She could not be far, he reasoned. Lighting a third match, he went in search of her. He had gone a few steps only when he heard somebody behind him. He turned. Torchlight lit the fright on his face. It was only the Italian shoes. "There's no way in." "There's no need to blind me," Garvey said. The beam dropped. I'm sorry. There's somebody here, Cole groaned. A girl. A girl? You know something about it, maybe? No. She was stark naked, standing 3 or 4 yards from me. Jerry looked at Garvey, mystified. Was the man suffering from sexual delusions? I tell you I saw a girl, Garvey protested, though no word of contradiction had been offered. If you hadn't arrived, I'd have had my hands on her. He glanced back down the corridor. Get some light down there. Jerry trained the beam on the maze. There was no sign of life. Damn, said Garvey, his regret quite genuine. He looked back at Jerry. All right, he said. Let's get the hell out of here. I'm interested, he said as they parted on the step. The project has potential. Do you have ground plans of the place? No, but I can get my hands on one. Do that. Garvey was lighting a fresh cigar. And send me your proposals in more detail. Then we'll talk again. It took a considerable bribe to get the plans of the pools out of his contact at the architect's department, but Jerry eventually secured them. On paper, the complex looked like a labyrinth, and, like the best labyrinths, there was no order apparent in the layout of shower rooms and bathrooms and changing rooms. It was Carol who proved that thesis wrong. What is this? She asked him as he pored over the plans that evening. They'd had 4 or 5 hours together at his flat, hours without the bickering and bad feeling that had soured their time together of late. It's the ground plan of the swimming pools on Leopold Road. Do you want another brandy? No, thanks. She peered at the plan while he got up to refill his glass. I think I've got Garvey in on the deal. You're going to do business with him, are you? Don't make me sound like a white slaver. The man's got money. Dirty money. Wants a little dirt between friends. She looked at him frostily, and he wished he could have played back the previous 10 seconds and erased the comment. I need this project, he said, taking his drink across the sofa and sitting opposite her. The ground plan spread on the low table between them. I need something to go right for me for once. Her eyes refused to grant him a reprieve. I just think Garvey is like a bad news, she said. I don't care how much money he's got. He's a villain, Jerry. So I should give the whole thing up, should I? Is that what you're saying? They'd had this argument in one guise or another several times in the last few weeks. I should just forget all the hard labour I've put in and add this failure to all the others. There's no need to shout. I'm not shouting, she shrugged. All right, she said quietly. You're not shouting. Christ! She went back to pursuing the ground plan. He watched her from over the rim of his whiskey tumbler, at the parting down the middle of her head and the fine blonde hair that divided from there. They made so little sense to each other, he thought. The processes that brought them to their present impasse were perfectly obvious, yet time and again they failed to find the common ground necessary for a fruitful exchange of views. Not simply on this matter, on 100 others. Whatever thoughts buzzed beneath her tender scalp, they were a mystery to him, and his to her, presumably. It's a spiral, she said. What is? The pool is designed like a spiral, look. He stood up to get a bird's eye view of the ground plan as she traced a route through the passageways with her index finger. She was right. Though the imperatives of the architect's brief had muddied the clarity of the image, there was, indeed, a rough spiral built into the maze of corridors and rooms. Her circling fingers drew tighter and yet tighter loops as it described the shape. At last it came to rest on the large pool, the locked pool. He stared at the plan in silence. Without her pointing it out, he knew he could have looked at the design for a week and never seen the underlying structure. Carol decided she would not stay the night. It was not, she tried to explain at the door, that things between them were over, only that she valued their intimacy too much to misuse it as a bandaging. He half grasped the point. She too pictured them as wounded animals. At least they had some metaphorical life in common. He was not unused to sleeping alone. In many ways he preferred to be solitary in his bed than to share it with somebody, even Carol. But tonight he wanted her with him. Not her even, but somebody. He felt sourcelessly fretful, like a child. When sleep came, it fled again, as if in fear of dreams. Sometime towards dawn, he got up, preferring wakefulness to that wretched sleep-hopping, wrapped his dressing gown around his shivering body, and went through to brew himself some tea. The ground plan was still spread on the coffee table where they had left it from the night before. Sipping the warm, sweet Assam, he stood and pondered over it. Now that Carol had pointed it out, all he could concentrate upon, despite the clutter of marginalia that demanded his attention, was the spiral, that undisputable evidence of a hidden hand at work beneath the apparent chaos of the maze. It seized his eye and seduced it into following its unremitting route, round and round, tighter and tighter. And towards what? A locked swimming pool. Tea drunk, he returned to bed. This time, fatigue got the better of his nerves, and the sleep he'd been denied washed over him. He was woken at 7:15 by Carol, who was phoning before she went to work to apologise for the previous night. "I don't want everything to go wrong between us, Jerry. You do know that, don't you? You know you're precious to me." He couldn't take love talk in the morning. What seemed romantic at midnight struck him as ridiculous at dawn. He answered her declarations of commitment as best he could, and made an arrangement to see her the following evening. Then he returned to his pillow. Scarcely a quarter hour had passed since he'd visited the pools without Ezra Garvey thinking of the girl he'd glimpsed in the corridor. Her face had come back to him during dinner with his wife, and sex with his mistress. So untrammelled, that face. So bright with possibilities. Garvey thought of himself as a woman's man. Unlike most of his fellow potentates whose consorts were a convenience, best paid to be absent when not required for some specific function, Garvey enjoyed the company of the opposite sex. Their voices, their perfume, their laughter. His greed for their proximity knew few bounds. They were precious creatures whose company he was willing to spend small fortunes to secure. His jacket was therefore weighed down with money and expensive trinkets when he returned that morning to Leopold Road. The pedestrians on the street were too concerned to keep their heads dry, a cold and steady drizzle had fallen since dawn, to notice the man on the steps standing under a black umbrella while another bent to the business of undoing the padlock. Chanderman was an expert with locks. The shackles snapped open within seconds. Garvey lowered his umbrella and slipped into the vestibule. "Wait here," he instructed Chanderman, "and close the door." "Yes, sir." "If I need you, I'll shout. You got the torch?" Chanderman produced the torch from his jacket. Garvey took it, switched it on, and disappeared down the corridor. Either it was substantially colder outside than it had been the day before yesterday, or else the interior was hot. He unbuttoned his jacket and loosened his tightly knotted tie. He welcomed the heat, reminding him as it did of the sheen on the dream girl's skin, of the heat-languid look in her dark eyes. He advanced down the corridor, the torchlight splashing off the tiles. His sense of direction had always been good. It took him a short time only to find his way to the spot outside the large pool where he had encountered the girl. There, he stood still and listened. Garvey was a man used to looking over his shoulder. All his professional life, whether in or out of prison, he had needed to watch for the assassin at his back. Such ceaseless vigilance had made him sensitive to the least sign of human presence. Sounds another man might have ignored played a warning tattoo upon his eardrum. But here, nothing. Silence in the corridors. Silence in the sweating anterooms and the Turkish baths. Silence in every tiled enclave from one end of the building to the other. And yet he knew he was not alone. When five senses failed him, a sixth, belonging perhaps more to the beast in him than the sophisticate his expensive suit spoke of, sensed presences. This faculty had saved his hide more than once. Now he hoped it would guide him into the arms of beauty. Trusting to instinct, he extinguished the torch and headed off down the corridor from which the girl had first emerged, feeling his way along the walls. His quarry's presence tantalized him. He suspected she was a mere wall away, keeping pace with him along some secret passage he had no access to. The thought of this stalking pleased him. She and he, alone in this sweating maze, playing a game that both knew must end in capture. He moved stealthily, his pulse ticking off the seconds of the chase at neck and wrist and groin. His crucifix was glued to his breastbone with perspiration. At last the corridor divided. He halted. There was precious little light. What there was etched the tunnels deceptively. Impossible to judge distance, but trusting to his instinct, he turned left and followed his nose. Almost immediately, a door. It was open, and he walked through into a larger space, or so he guessed from the muted sound of his footsteps. Again he stood still. This time, his straining ears were rewarded with a sound. Across the room from him, the soft pad of naked feet on the tiles. Was it his imagination, or did he even glimpse the girl, her body carved from the gloom, paler than the surrounding darkness and smoother? Yes, it was she. He almost called out after her, and then thought better of it. Instead, he went in silent pursuit, content to play her game for as long as it pleased her. Crossing the room, he stepped through another door which led onto a further tunnel. The air here was much warmer than anywhere else in the building, clammy and ingratiating as it pressed itself upon him. A moment's anxiety caught his throat, that he was neglecting every article of an autocrat's faith, putting his head so willingly into this warm noose. It could so easily be a setup, the girl, the chase. Around the next corner, the breasts and the beauty might have gone, and there would be a knife at his heart. And yet he knew this wasn't so, knew that the footfall ahead was a woman's, light and lithe, that the swelter that brought new tides of sweat from him could nurture only softness and passivity here. No knife could prosper in such heat. Its edge would soften, its ambition go neglected. He was safe. Ahead, the footsteps had halted. He halted too. There was light from somewhere, though its source was not apparent. He licked his lips, tasting salt, then advanced. Beneath his fingers the tiles were glossed with water. Under his heels they were slick. Anticipation mounted in him with every step. Now the light was brightening. It was not day. Sunlight had no route into this sanctum. This was more like moonlight, soft-edged, evasive. Though that too must be exiled here, he thought. Whatever its origins, by it, he finally set eyes on the girl. Or rather on a girl, for it was not the same he had seen 2 days previous. Naked she was, young she was, but in all other respects, different. He caught a glance from her before she fled from him down the corridor and turned a corner. Puzzlement now lent piquancy to the chase. Not one, but 2 girls occupying this secret place. Why? He looked behind him to be certain his escape route lay open should he wish to retreat, but his memory, befuddled by the scented air, refused a clear picture of the way he'd come. A twinge of concern checked his exhilaration, but he refused to succumb to it, and pressed on, following the girl to the end of the corridor and turning left after her. The passageway ran for a short way before making another left, the girl even now disappearing around that corner. Dimly aware that these gyrations were becoming tighter as he turned upon himself and upon himself again, he went where she led, panting now with the breath-quenching air and the insistence of the chase. Suddenly, as he turned one final corner, the heat became smotheringly close, and the passageway delivered him out into a small, dimly lit chamber. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt. The veins on the back of his hands stood out like cord. He was aware of how his heart and lungs were labouring, but he was relieved to see the chase finished here. The object of his pursuit was standing with her back to him across the chamber, and at the sight of her smooth back and exquisite buttocks, his claustrophobia evaporated. "Girl," he panted, you led me quite a chase." She seemed not to hear him, or, more likely, was extending the game to his limits out of waywardness. He started across the slippery tiles towards her. "I'm talking to you." As he came within 6 feet of her, she turned. It was not the girl he had just pursued through the corridor, nor indeed the one he had seen 2 days previous. This creature was another altogether. His gaze rested on her unfamiliar face a few seconds only, however, before sliding giddily down to meet the child she held in her arms. It was suckling, like any newborn babe, pulling at her young breast with no little hunger. But in his 4.5 decades of life, Garvey's eyes had never seen a creature its like. Nausea rose in him. To see the girl giving suck was surprise enough, but to such a thing, such an outcast of any tribe, human or animal, was almost more than his stomach could stand. Hell itself had offspring more embraceable. "What in Christ's name?" The girl stared at Garvey's alarm, and a wave of laughter broke over her face. He shook his head. The child in her arms uncurled a succoured limb and clamped it to the comforter's bosom so as to get better purchase. The gesture lashed Garvey's disgust into rage. Ignoring the girl's protests, he snatched the abomination from her arms, holding it long enough to feel the glistening sack of its body squirm in his grasp, then flung it as hard as he could against the far wall of the chamber. As it struck the tiles, it cried out, its complaint ending almost as soon as it began, only to be taken up instantly by the mother. She ran across the room to where the child lay, its apparently boneless body split open by the impact. One of its limbs, of which it possessed at least 6, attempted to reach up to touch her sobbing face. She gathered the thing up into her arms. Shreds of tiny fluid ran across her belly and into her groin. Out beyond the chamber, something gave voice. Garvey had no doubt of its cue. It was answering the death cry of the child and the rising wail of its mother. But this sound was more distressing than either. Garvey's imagination was an impoverished faculty. Beyond his dreams of wealth and women lay a wasteland. Yet now, at the sound of that voice, the wasteland bloomed and gave forth horrors he believed himself incapable of conceiving. Not portraits of monsters which, at the best, could be no more than assemblies of experienced phenomena. What his mind created was more feeling than sight, belonged to his marrow, not to his mind. All certainty trembled, masculinity, power, the twin imperatives of dread and reason, all turned their collars up and denied knowledge of him. He shook, afraid as only dreams made him afraid, while the cry went on and on. Then he turned his back on the chamber and ran, the light throwing his shadow in front of him down the dim corridor. His sense of direction had deserted him. At the first intersection, and then at the second, he made an error. A few yards on, he realized his mistake and tried to double back, but merely exacerbated the confusion. The corridors all looked alike, the same tiles, the same half-light. Each fresh corner he turned either led him into a chamber he had not passed through, or complete cul-de-sacs. His panic spiraled. The wailing had now ceased. He was alone with his rasping breath and half-spoken curses. Colquhoun was responsible for this torment, and Garvey swore he would have its purpose beaten out of the man, even if he had to break every bone in Colquhoun's body personally. He clung to thoughts of that beating as he ran on. It was his only comfort. Indeed, so preoccupied did he become with the thought of the agonies he'd make Colquhoun suffer, he failed to realize that he had traced his way back round in circles and was running back towards the light until his sliding heels delivered him into a familiar chamber. The child lay on the floor, dead and discarded. Its mother was nowhere to be seen. Garvey halted and took stock of his situation. If he went back the way he'd come, The route would only confound him again. If he went ahead, through the chamber, and towards the light, he might cut the Gordian knot and be delivered back to his starting point. The swift wit of the solution pleased him. Cautiously, he crossed the chamber to the door on the other side and peered through. Another short corridor presented itself, and beyond that, a door that led to an open space. The pool! Surely, the pool! He threw caution to the wind and moved out of the chamber and along the passage. With every step he took, the heat intensified. His head thumped with it. He pressed on to the end of the passageway and out into the arena beyond. The large pool had not been drained, unlike the smaller. Rather, it was full almost to brimming, not with clear water, but with a scummy broth that steamed even in the heat of the interior. This was the source of the light. The water in the pool gave off a phosphorescence that tinged everything, the tiles, the diving board, the changing rooms, himself, no doubt, with the same fulvous wash. He scanned the scene in front of him. There was no sign of the woman. His route to the exit lay unchallenged, nor could he see sign of padlock or chains on the double doors. He began towards them. His heel slid on the tiles, and he glanced down briefly to see that he had crossed a trail of fluid, difficult in the bewitched light to make out its colour, that either ended at the water's edge or began there. He looked back towards the water, curiosity getting the better of him. The steam swirled, an eddy toyed with the scum, and there, his eyes caught sight of a dark, anonymous shape sliding beneath the skin of the water. He thought of the creature he'd killed, of its formless body and the dangling loops of its limbs. Was this another of that species? The liquid brightness lapsed against the poolside at his feet. Continents of scum broke into archipelagos. Of the swimmer, there was no sign. Irritated, he looked away from the water. He was no longer alone. 3 girls had appeared from somewhere and were moving down the edge of the pool towards him. One he recognized as the girl he had first seen here. She was wearing a dress, unlike her sisters. One of her breasts was bared. She looked at him gravely as he approached. By her side she trailed a rope, decorated along its length with stained ribbons, tied in limp but extravagant bows. At the arrival of these 3 graces, the fermenting waters of the pool were stirred into a frenzy as its occupants rose to meet the women. Garvey could see 3 or 4 restless forms teasing but not breaking the surface. He was caught between his instinct to take flight, the rope, though prettified, was still a rope, and the desire to linger and see what the pool contained. He glanced towards the door. He was within 10 yards of it. A quick dash and he'd be out into the cool air of the corridor. From there, Chanderman was within bailing distance. The girls stood a few feet from him and watched him. He returned their looks. All the desires that had brought him here had taken heel. He no longer wanted to cup the breasts of these creatures or dabble at the intersections of their gleaming thighs. These women were not what they seemed. Their quietness wasn't docility, but a drug trance. Their nakedness wasn't sexuality, but a horrid indifference which offended him. Even their youth and all that it brought, the softness of their skins, the gloss of their hair, even that was somehow corrupt. When the girl in the dress reached out and touched his sweating face, Garvey made a small cry of disgust, as if he'd been licked by a snake. She was not fazed by his response, but stepped closer to him still, her eyes fixed on him, smelling not of perfume like his mistress, but of fleshliness. Affronted as he was, he could not turn away. He stood, meeting the slut's eyes, as she kissed his cheek, and the beribboned rope was wrapped around his neck. Jerry called Garvey's offices at half-hourly intervals throughout the day. At first he was told that the man was out of the offices. and would be available later that afternoon. As the day wore on, however, the message changed. Garvey was not going to be in the office at all that day, Jerry was informed. Mr. Garvey is feeling unwell, the secretary told him. He has gone home to rest. Please call again tomorrow. Jerry left with her the message that he had secured the ground plan to the pools and would be delighted to meet and discuss their plans at Mr. Garvey's convenience. Carol called in the late afternoon. "Shall we go out tonight?" she said. "Maybe a film?" "What do you want to see?" he said. "Oh, I hadn't really thought that far. We'll talk about it this evening, shall we?" They ended up going to a French movie, which seemed, as far as Jerry could grasp, completely lacking in plot. It was simply a series of dialogues between characters discussing their traumas and their aspirations, the former being in direct proportion to the failure of the latter. It left him feeling torpid. "You didn't like it?" "Not much. All that browbeating. And no shootout." "No shootout." She smiled to herself. "What's so funny?" "Nothing." "Don't say nothing." She shrugged. "I was just smiling, that's all. Can't I smile?" "Jesus, all this conversation needs is subtitles." They walked along Oxford Street a little way. "Do you want to eat?" he said as they came to the head of Poland Street. "We could go to the Red Fort." "No, thanks. I hate eating late." "For Christ's sake, let's not argue about a bloody film." "Who's arguing?" "You're so infuriating." "Well, that's something we've got in common anyhow," she returned. Her neck was flushed. "You said this morning—" "What?" "About us not losing each other." "That was this morning," she said, eyes steely, and then suddenly, "You don't give a fuck, Jerry. Not about me, not about anybody." She stared at him, almost defying him not to respond. When he failed to, she seemed curiously satisfied. "Good night," she said, and began to walk away from him. He watched her take 5, 6, 7 steps from him, the deepest part of him wanting to call after her, but a dozen irrelevancies, pride, fatigue, inconvenience, blocked his doing so. What eventually uprooted him and put her name on his lips was the thought of an empty bed tonight, of the sheets warm only where he lay, and chilly as hell to the left and right of him. "Carol!" She didn't turn, her step didn't even falter. He had to trot to catch up with her, conscious that this scene was probably entertaining the passers-by. "Carol!" He caught hold of her arm. Now she stopped. When he moved round to face her, he was shocked to see that she was crying. This discomforted him. He hated her tears only marginally less than his own. I surrender," he said, trying a smile. "The film was a masterpiece. How's that?" She refused to be soothed by his antics. Her face was swollen with unhappiness. "Don't," he said. "Please don't. I'm not—" Very good at apologies, he wanted to say, but he was so bad at them he couldn't even manage that much. "Never mind," she said softly. She wasn't angry, he saw, only miserable. "Come back to the flat." "I don't want to." "I want you to," he replied. That at least was sincerely meant. "I don't like talking in the street." He held a cab, and they made their way back to Kentish Town, keeping their silence. Halfway up the stairs to the door of the first flat, Carol said, "Foul perfume." There was a strong, acidic smell lingering on the stairs. "Somebody's been up here," he said, suddenly anxious, and hurried on up the flight to the front door of his flat. It was open. The lock had been unceremoniously forced. The wood of the door jamb splintered. He cursed. "What's wrong?" Carol asked, following up the stairs. "Break him." He stepped into the flat and switched on the light. The interior was chaos. The whole flat had been comprehensively trashed. Everywhere, petty acts of vandalism, pictures smashed, pillows degutted, furniture reduced to timber. He stood in the middle of the turmoil and shook, while Carol went from room to room, finding the same thorough destruction in each. "This is personal, Jerry." He nodded. "I'll call the police," she volunteered. "You find out what's missing." He did as he was told, white-faced. The blow of this invasion numbed him as he walked listlessly through the flat to survey the pandemonium, turning broken items over, pushing drawers back into place. He found himself imagining the intruders about their business, laughing as they worked through his clothes and keepsakes. In the corner of his bedroom, he found a heap of his photographs. They had urinated on them. "The police are on their way," Carol told him. "They said not to touch anything." "Too late," he murmured. What's missing? Nothing, he told her. All the valuables, the stereo and video equipment, his credit cards, his few items of jewellery were present. Only then did he remember the ground plan. He returned to the living room and proceeded to root through the wreckage, but he knew damn well he wasn't going to find it. Garvey, he said. What about him? He came for the ground plan of the pools, or sent someone. Why? Carol replied, looking at the chaos. You were going to give it to him anyway. Jerry shook his head. You were the one who warned me to stay clear. I never expected something like this. That makes two of us. The police came and went, offering faint apologies for the fact that they thought an arrest unlikely. There's a lot of vandalism around at the moment, the officer said. There's nobody in downstairs. No, they're away. Last hope, I'm afraid. We're getting calls like this all the time. You're insured? Yes. Well, that's something. Throughout the interview, Jerry kept silent on his suspicions, though he was repeatedly tempted to point the finger. There was little purpose in accusing Garvey at this juncture. For one, Garvey would have alibis prepared. For another, what would unsubstantiated accusations do but inflame the man's unreason further? What will you do? Carol asked him when the police picked up their shrugs and walked. I don't know. I can't even be certain it was Garvey. One minute he's all sweetness and light, the next this. How do I deal with a mind like that? You don't. You leave it well be, she replied. Do you want to stay here or go over to my place? Stay, he said. They made a perfunctory attempt to restore the status quo, righting the furniture that was not too crippled to stand, and clearing up the broken glass. Then they turned the slashed mattress over, located 2 unmutilated cushions, and went to bed. She wanted to make love, but that reassurance, like so much of his life of late, was doomed to failure. There was no making good between the sheets what had been so badly soured out of them. His anger made him rough, and his roughness in turn angered her. She frowned beneath him, her kisses unwilling and tight. Her reluctance only spurned him onto fresh crashness. Stop, she said, as he was about to enter her. I don't want this. He did, and badly. He pushed before she could further her objections. I said, don't, Jerry. He shut out her voice. He was halfway as heavy again as she. Stop! He closed his eyes. She told him again to stop, this time with real fury, but he just thrust harder, the way she'd ask him to sometimes when the heat was really on, beg him to even. But now she only swore at him and threatened, and every word she said made him more intent not to be cheated out of this, though he felt nothing at his groin but fullness and discomfort, and the urge to be rid. She began to fight, raking at his back with her nails and pulling at his hair to unclamp his face from her neck. It passed through his head as he laboured that she would hate him for this, and on that, at least, they would be of one accord. But the thought was soon lost to sensation. The poison passed. He rolled off her. Bastard, she said. His back stung. When he got up from the bed, he left blood on the sheets. Digging through the chaos in the living room, he located an unbroken bottle of whiskey. The glasses, however, were all smashed, and out of absurd fastidiousness, he didn't want to drink from the bottle. He squatted against the wall, his back chilled, feeling neither wretched nor proud. The front door opened and was slammed. He waited, listening to Carol's feet on the stairs. Then tears came, though these too he felt utterly detached from. Finally, the bout dispatched, he went through into the kitchen, found a cup, and drank himself senseless out of that. Garvey's study was an impressive room. He'd had it fashioned after that of a tax lawyer he'd known, the walls lined with books purchased by the yard, the colour of carpet and paintwork alike muted, as though by an accrual of cigar smoke and learning. When he found sleep difficult, as he did now, he could retire to the study, sit on his leather-backed chair behind a vast desk, and dream of legitimacy. Not tonight, however. Tonight his thoughts were otherwise preoccupied. Always, however much he might try to turn to another route, they went back to Leopold Road. He remembered little of what had happened at the pools. That in itself was distressing. He'd always prided himself upon the acuteness of his memory. Indeed, his recall of faces seen and favours done had, in no small measure, helped him to his present power. Of the hundreds in his employ, he boasted that there was not a doorkeeper or a cleaner he could not address by their Christian name. But of the events at Leopold Road, barely 36 hours old, he had only the vaguest recollection. Of the women closing upon him and the rope tightening around his neck. Of their leading him along the lip of the pool to some chamber, the vileness of which had practically snatched his senses away. What had followed his arrival there moved in his memory like those forms in the filth of the pool, obscure but horribly distressing. There had been humiliation and horrors, hadn't there? Beyond that, he remembered nothing. He was not a man to kowtow to such ambiguities without argument, however. If there were mysteries to be uncovered here, then he would do so, and take the consequences of revelation. His first offensive had been sending Chanderman and Fryer to turn Colquhoun's place over. If, as he suspected, this whole enterprise was some elaborate trap devised by his enemies, then Colquhoun was involved in its setting. No more than a front man, no doubt, certainly not the mastermind. But Garvey was satisfied that the destruction of Colquhoun's goods and chattels would remind his masters of his intent to fight. It had borne other fruit, too. Chanderman had returned with the ground plan of the pools. They were spread on Garvey's desk now. He had traced his route through the complex time and again, hoping that his memory might be jogged. He had been disappointed. Weary, he got up and went to the study window. The garden behind the house was vast and severely schooled. He could see little of the immaculate borders at the moment, however. The starlight barely described the world outside. All he could see was his own reflection in the polished pane. As he focused on it, his outline seemed to waver, and he felt a loosening in his lower belly, as if something had come unknotted there. He put his hand to his abdomen. It twitched. It trembled, and for an instant he was back in the pools and naked, and something lumpen moved in front of his eyes. He almost yelled, but stopped himself by turning away from the window and staring at the room, at the carpets and the books and the furniture, at sober, solid reality. Even then the images refused to leave his head entirely. The coils of his innards were still jittery. It was several minutes before he could bring himself to look back at the reflection in the window. When at last he did, all trace of the vacillation had disappeared. He would countenance no more nights like this, sleepless and haunted. With the first light of dawn came the conviction that today was the day to break Mr. Colquhoun. Jerry tried to call Carol at her office that morning. She was repeatedly unavailable. Eventually, he simply gave up trying and turned his attentions to the Herculean task of restoring some order to the flat. He lacked the focus and the energy to do a good job, however. After a futile hour, in which he seemed not to have made more than a dent in the problem, he gave up. The chaos accurately reflected his opinion of himself. Best, perhaps, that it be left to lie. Just before noon, he received a call. "Mr. Colquhoun? Mr. Gerard Colquhoun?" "That's right." "My name's Fryer. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Garvey." "Oh?" Was this to gloat or threaten further mischief? "Mr. Garvey was expecting some proposals from you," Fryer said. "Proposals?" "He's very enthusiastic about the Leopold Road project, Mr. Colquhoun. He feels there's substantial monies to be made." Jerry said nothing. This palaver confounded him. "Mr. Garvey would like another meeting as soon as possible." "Yes?" "At the pools. There's a few architectural details he'd like to show his colleagues." "I see. Would you be available later on today?" "Yes, of course. 4:30? The conversation more or less ended there, leaving Jerry mystified. There had been no trace of enmity in Fryer's manners, no hint, however subtle, of bad blood between the two parties. Perhaps, as the police had suggested, the events of the previous night had been the work of anonymous vandals, the theft of the ground plan, a whim of those responsible. His depressed spirits rose. All was not lost. He rang Carol again, buoyed up by this turn of events. This time he did not take the repeated excuses of her colleagues, but insisted on speaking to her. Finally, she picked up the phone. I don't want to talk to you, Jerry. Just go to hell. Just hear me out. She slammed the receiver down before he said another word. He rang back again immediately. And when she answered and heard his voice, she seemed baffled that he was so eager to make amends. Why are you even trying? She said. Jesus Christ, what's the use? He could hear the tears in her throat. I want you to understand how sick I feel. Let me make it right. Please let me make it right. She didn't reply to his appeal. Don't put the phone down. Please don't. I know it was unforgivable. Jesus, I know. Still, she kept her silence. Just think about it, will you? Give me a chance to put things right? Will you do that? Very quietly, she said, I don't see the use. May I call you tomorrow? He heard her sigh. May I? Yes. Yes. The line went dead. He set out for his meeting at Leopold Road with a full 3/4 of an hour to spare, but halfway to his destination the rain came on, great spots of it, which defied the best efforts of his windscreen wipers. The traffic slowed. He crawled for half a mile, with only the brake lights of the vehicle ahead visible through the deluge. The minutes ticked by, and his anxiety mounted. By the time he'd edged his way out of the fouled-up traffic to find another route, he was already late. There was nobody waiting on the steps of the pools, but Garvey's powder-blue Rover was parked a little way down the road. There was no sign of the chauffeur. Jerry found a place to park on the opposite side of the road and crossed through the rain. It was a matter of 50 yards from the door of the car to that of the pools, but by the time he reached the spot, he was drenched and breathless. The door was open. Garvey had clearly manipulated the lock and slipped out of the downpour. Jerry ducked inside. Garvey was not in the vestibule, but somebody was. A man of Jerry's height, but with half the width again. He was wearing leather gloves. His face, but for the absence of seams, might have been of the same material. Colquhoun. Yes. Mr. Garvey's waiting for you inside. Who are you? Chanderman, the man replied. Go right in. There was a light at the far end of the corridor. Jerry pushed open the glass-panelled vestibule doors and walked down towards it. Behind him he heard the front door snap closed, and then the echoing tread of Garvey's lieutenant. Garvey was talking with another man, shorter than Chanderman, who was holding a sizable torch. When the pair heard Jerry approach, they looked his way. Their conversation abruptly ceased. Garvey offered no welcoming comment or hand, but merely said, About time. The rain, Jerry began, then thought better of offering a self-evident explanation. You'll catch your death, the man with the torch said. Jerry immediately recognised the dulcet tones of Friar. The same, the man returned. Well, pleased to meet you. They shook hands, and as they did so, Jerry caught sight of Garvey, who was staring at him as though in search of a second head. The man didn't say anything for what seemed like half a minute, but simply studied the growing discomfort on Jerry's face. I'm not a stupid man, Garvey said eventually. The statement, out of nowhere, begged response. I don't even believe you're the main man in all of this, Garvey went on. I'm prepared to be charitable. What's this about? Charitable? Garvey repeated, because I think you're out of your depth. Isn't that right? Jerry just frowned. I think that's right, Fryer replied. I don't think you understand how much trouble you're in even now, do you? Garvey said. Jerry was suddenly uncomfortably aware of Chanderman standing behind him and of his own utter invulnerability. But I don't think ignorance should ever be bliss, Garvey was saying. I mean, even if you don't understand, that doesn't make you exempt, does it? I haven't a clue what you're talking about, Jerry protested mildly. Garvey's face by the light of the torch was drawn and pale. He looked in need of a holiday. This place, Garvey returned. I'm talking about this place, the women you put in here, for my benefit. What's it all about, Colquhoun? That's all I want to know. What's it all about? Jerry shrugged lightly. Each word Garvey uttered merely perplexed him more, but the man had already told him ignorance would not be considered a legitimate excuse. Perhaps a question was the wisest reply. You saw women here? He said. Whores, more like, Garvey responded. His breath smelt of last week's cigar ash. Who are you working for, Colquhoun? For myself? The deal I offered... Forget your fucking deal, Garvey said. I'm not interested in deals. I see, Jerry replied. Well, then I don't see any point in this conversation. He took a half step away from Garvey, but the man's arm shot out and caught hold of his rain-sodden coat. I didn't tell you to go, Garvey said. Well, I've got business. Then it'll have to wait, the other replied, scarcely relaxing his grip. Jerry knew that if he tried to shrug off Garvey and make a dash for the front door, he'd be stopped by Chanderman before he made 3 paces. If, on the other hand, he didn't try to escape. I don't much like your sort, Garvey said, removing his hand. Smart brats with an eye to the main chance think you're so damn clever. Just you've got a fancy accent and a silk tie. Let me tell you something. He jabbed his finger at Jerry's throat. I don't give a shit about you. I just want to know who you work for. Understand? I already told you. Who do you work for? Garvey insisted, punctuating each word with a fresh jab. Or you're going to feel very sick. For Christ's sake, I'm not working for anybody and I don't know anything about any women. Don't make it worse than it already is, Fryer advised with feigned concern. I'm telling the truth. I think the man wants to be hurt, Fryer said. Chanderman gave a joyless laugh. Is that what you want? Just name some names, Garvey said, or we're going to break your legs. The threat, unequivocal as it was, did nothing for Jerry's clarity of mind. He could think of no way out of this but to continue to insist upon his innocence. If he named some fictitious overlord, the lie would be uncovered in moments, and the consequences could only be worse for the attempted deception. Check my credentials, he pleaded. You've got the resources, dig around. I'm not company man, Garvey. I never have been. Garvey's eye left Jerry's face for a moment and moved to his shoulder. Jerry grasped the significance of the sign, a heartbeat too late to prepare himself for the blow to his kidneys from the man at his back. He pitched forward, but before he could collide with Garvey, Chanderman had snatched at his collar and was throwing him against the wall. He doubled up, the pain blinding him to all other thoughts. Vaguely, he heard Garvey asking him again who his boss was. He shook his head. His skull was full of ball bearings. They rattled between his ears. Jesus! Jesus! He said, groping for some words of defence to keep another beating at bay, but he was hauled upright before any presented itself. The torch beam was turned on him. He was ashamed of the tears that were rolling down his cheeks. Names, said Garvey. The ball bearings rattled on. Again, said Garvey, and Chanderman was moving in to give his fists further exercise. Garvey called him off as Jerry came close to passing out. The leather face withdrew. Stand up when I'm talking to you, Garvey said. Jerry attempted to oblige, but his body was less than willing to comply. It trembled. It felt fit to die. Stand up, Fryer reiterated, moving between Jerry and his tormentor to prod the point home. Now, in close proximity, Jerry smelt that acidic scent Carol had caught on the stairs. It was Fryer's cologne. Stand up, the man insisted. Jerry raised a feeble hand to shield his face from the blinding beam. He could not see any of the trio's faces, but he was dimly aware that Fryer was blocking Chanderman's access to him. To Jerry's right, Garvey struck a match and applied the flame to a cigar. A moment presented itself. Garvey occupied, the thud stymied. Jerry took it. Ducking down beneath the torch beam, he broke from his place against the wall, contriving to knock the torch from Fryer's hand as he did so. The light source clattered across the tiles and went out. In the sudden darkness, Jerry made a stumbling bid for freedom. Behind him he heard Garvey curse, heard Chanderman and Fryer collide as they scrambled for the fallen torch. He began to edge his way along the wall to the end of the corridor. There was evidently no safe route past his tormentors to the front door. His only hope lay in losing himself in the networks of corridors that lay ahead. He reached a corner and made a right, vaguely remembering that this led him off the main thoroughfare and into the service corridors. The beating that he'd taken, though interrupted before it could incapacitate, had rendered him breathless and bruised. He felt every step he took as a sharp pain in his lower abdomen and back. When he slipped on the slimy tiles, the impact almost made him cry out. At his back, Garvey was shouting again. The torch had been located. Its light bounced down the labyrinth to find him. Jerry hurried on, glad of the murky illumination, but not of its source. They would follow, and quickly, if, As Carol had said, the place was a simple spiral, the corridor describing a relentless loop with no way out of the configuration. He was lost, but he was committed. Head giddied by the mounting heat, he moved on, praying to find a fire exit that would give him passage out of this trap. "He went this way," Fryer said. "He must have done." Garvey nodded. It was, indeed, the likeliest route for Colquhoun to have taken, away from the light and into the labyrinth. "Shall we go after him?" Chanderman said. The man was fairly salivating to finish the beating he'd started. "He can't go far." "No," said Garvey. Nothing, not even the promise of the knighthood, would have induced him to follow. Fryer had already advanced down the passageway, a few yards, shining the torch beam on the glistening walls. "It's warm," he said. Garvey knew all too well how warm it was. Such heat wasn't natural, not for England. This was a temperate isle, that was why he'd never set foot off it. The sweltering heat of other countries bred grotesqueries he wanted no sight of. "What do we do?" Chanderman demanded. "Wait for him to come out?" Garvey pondered this. The smell from the corridor was beginning to distress him. His innards were churning, his skin was crawling. Instinctively, he put his hand to his groin. His manhood had shrunk in trepidation. "No," he said suddenly. "No?" "We're not waiting." "He can't stay in there forever." "I said no." He hadn't anticipated how profoundly the sweat of the place would upset him. Irritating as it was to let Colquhoun slip away like this, he knew that if he stayed here much longer, he risked losing his self-control. "You two can wait for him at his flat," he told Chanderman. "He'll have to come home sooner or later." "Damn shame," Fryer muttered as he emerged from the passageway. "I like a chase." Perhaps they weren't following. It was several minutes now since Jerry had heard the voices behind him. His heart had stopped its furious pumping. Now, with the adrenaline no longer giving speed to his heels and distracting his muscles from their bruisings, his pace slowed to a crawl. His body protested at even that. When the agonies of taking another step became too much, he slid down the wall and sat, slumped, across the passageway. His rain-drenched clothes clung to his body and about his throat. He felt both chilled and suffocated by them. He pulled at the knot of his tie and then unbuttoned his waistcoat and his shirt. The air in the labyrinth was warm on his skin. Its touch was welcome. He closed his eyes and made a studied attempt to mesmerize himself out of this pain. What was feeling but a trick of the nerve endings? There were techniques for dislocating the mind from the body and leaving agonies behind. But no sooner had his lids closed than he heard muted sounds somewhere nearby. Footsteps. The lull of voices. It wasn't Garvey and his associates. The voices were female. Jerry raised his leaden head and opened his eyes. Either he had become used to the darkness in his few moments of meditation, or else a light had crept into the passageway. It was surely the latter. He got to his feet. His jacket was dead weight and he slouched it off, leaving it to lie where he'd been squatting. Then he started in the direction of the light. The heat seemed to have risen considerably in the last few minutes. It gave him mild hallucinations. The walls seemed to have forsaken verticality, the air to have traded transparency for a shimmering aurora. He turned a corner. The light brightened. Another corner, and he was delivered into a small tiled chamber, the heat of which took his breath away. He gasped like a stranded fish and peered across the chamber, the air thickening with every pulse beat, at the door on the far side. The yellowish light through it was brighter still, but he could not summon the will to follow it a yard further. The heat here had defeated him. Sensing that he was within an ace of unconsciousness, he put his hand out to support himself, but his palm slid on the slick tiles and he fell, landing on his side. He could not prevent a shout spilling from him. Groaning his misery, he tucked his legs up close to his body and lay where he'd fallen. If Garvey had heard his yell and sent his lieutenants in pursuit, then so be it. He was past caring. The sound of movement reached him from across the chamber. Raising his head an inch from the floor, he opened his eyes to a slit. A naked girl had appeared in the doorway opposite, or so his reeling senses informed him. Her skin shone as if oiled. Here and there, on her breasts and thighs, were smudges of what might have been old blood. Not her blood, however. There was no wound to spoil her gleaming body. The girl had begun to laugh at him, a light, easy laugh that made him feel foolish. Its musicality entranced him, however, and he made an effort to get a better look at her. She had started to move across the chamber towards him, still laughing, and now he saw that there were others behind her. These were the women Garvey had babbled about. This, the trap he had accused Jerry of setting. "Who are you?" he murmured as the girl approached him. Her laughter faltered when she looked down at his pain-contorted features. He attempted to sit upright, but his arms were numb, and he slid back to the tiles again. The woman had not answered his inquiry, nor did she make any attempt to help him. She simply stared down at him as a pedestrian might at a drunk in the gutter, her face unreadable. Looking up at her, Jerry felt his tenuous grip on consciousness slipping. The heat, his pain, and now this sudden eruption of beauty was too much for him. The distant women were disappearing into darkness, the entire chamber folding up like a magician's box, until the sublime creature in front of him claimed his attention utterly. And now, at her silent insistence, his mind's eye seemed to be plucked from his head, and suddenly he was speeding over her skin, her flesh a landscape, each pore a pit, each hair a pylon. He was hers utterly. She drowned him in her eyes and flayed him with her lashes. She rolled him across her abdomen and down the soft channel of her spine. She took him between her buttocks and then up into her heat and out again, just as he thought he must burn alive. The velocity exhilarated him. He was aware that his body, somewhere below, was hyperventilating in its terror, but his imagination, careless of breath, went willingly where she sent him, looping like a bird until he was thrown, ragged and dizzy, back into the cup of his skull. Before he could apply the fragile tool of reason to the phenomena he had just experienced, his eyes fluttered closed, and he passed out. Colquhoun's faint lasted only a few minutes, but when he came to, he was aware of his body as he had seldom been before. As a trap. Its fragility was a trap. Its shape, its size, its very gender was a trap. And there was no flying out of it. He was shackled to, or in, this wretchedness. These thoughts came and went. In between them there were brief sights through which he fell giddily, and still briefer moments in which he glimpsed the world outside himself. The women had picked him up. His head lolled, his hair dragged on the floor. I am a trophy, he thought in a more coherent instant. Then the darkness came again. And again he struggled to the surface, and now they were carrying him along the edge of the large pool. His nostrils were filled with contradictory scents, both delectable and fetid. From the corner of his lazy eye he could see water so bright it seemed to burn as it lapped the shores of the pool. And something else too. Shadows moving in the brightness. They mean to drown me, he thought. And then, I'm already drowning. He imagined water filling his mouth, imagined the forms he had glimpsed in the pool, invading his throat and slipping into his belly. He struggled to vomit them back up, his body convulsing. A hand was laid on his face. The palm was blissfully cool. Hush, somebody murmured to him, and at the words his delusions melted away. He felt himself coaxed out of his terrors and into consciousness. The hand had evaporated from his brow. He looked around the gloomy room for his saviour, but his eyes didn't travel far. On the other side of this chamber, which looked to have been a communal shower room, several pipes set high in the wall delivered solid arcs of water onto the tiles, where gutters channeled it away. A fine spray and the gushing of the fountains filled the air. Jerry sat up. There was movement behind the cascading well of water, a shape too vast by far to be human. He peered through the drizzle to try and make sense of the folds of flesh. Was it an animal? There was a pungent smell in here that had something of the menagerie about it. Moving with considerable caution so as not to arouse the beast's attention, Jerry attempted to stand up. His legs, however, were not the equal of his intention. All he could do was crawl a little way across the room on his hands and knees, and peer, one beast at another, through the veil. He sensed that he was sensed, that the dark, recumbent creature had turned its eyes in his direction. Beneath its gaze he felt his skin creep with goose flesh, but he couldn't take his eyes off it. And then, as he squinted to scrutinize it better, a spark of phosphorescence began in its substance and spread, fluttering waves of jaundiced light up and across its tremendous form, revealing itself to Colquhoun. Not it, she. He knew indisputably that this creature was female, though it resembled no species or genus he knew of. As the ripples of luminescence moved through the creature's physique, it revealed with every fresh pulsation some new and phenomenal configuration. Watching her, Jerry thought of something slow and molten, glass perhaps, or stone, its flesh extruded into elaborate forms and recalled again into the furnace to be remade. She had neither head nor limbs, recognizable as such, but her contours were ripe with clusters of bright bubbles that might have been eyes, and she threw out here and there iridescent ribbons, slow pastel flames that seemed momentarily to ignite the very air. Now the body issued a series of soft noises, scuttlings and sighs. He wondered if he was being addressed, and if so, how he was expected to respond. Hearing footfalls behind him, he glanced round at one of the women for guidance. "Don't be afraid," she said. "I'm not," he replied. It was the truth. The prodigy in front of him was electrifying, but woke no fear in him. "What is she?" he asked. The woman stood close to him. Her skin, bathed by the shimmering light off the creatures, was golden. Despite the circumstance, or perhaps because of them, he felt a tremor of desire. "She is the Madonna, the Virgin Mother." "Mother," Jerry mouthed, swivelling his head back to look at the creature again. The waves of phosphorescence had ceased to break out across her body. Now the light pulsed in one part of her anatomy only, and at this region, in rhythm with the pulse, the Madonna's substance was swelling and splitting. Behind him he heard further footsteps, and now whispers echoed about the chamber, and chiming laughter, and applause. The Madonna was giving birth. The swollen flesh was opening, liquid light gushing. The smell of smoke and blood filled the shower room. A girl gave a cry, as if in sympathy with the Madonna. The applause mounted, and suddenly the slit spasmed and delivered the child, something between a squid and a shorn lamb, onto the tiles. The water from its pipes slapped it into consciousness immediately, and it threw back its head to look about it, its single eye, vast and perfectly lucid. It squirmed on the tiles for a few moments before the girl at Jerry's side stepped forth into the veil of water and picked it up. Its toothless mouth sought out her breast immediately. The girl delivered it to her tit. "No, not a human. Not human, Jerry murmured. He had not prepared himself for a child so strange, yet so unequivocally intelligent. Are all the children like that? The surrogate mother gazed down at the sack of life in her arms. No one is like another, she replied. We feed them. Some die, others live and go their ways. Where, for God's sake? To the water, to the sea, into dreams. She cooed to it, a fluted limb in which light ran as it had in its parent, paddled the air with pleasure. And the father? She needs no husband, the reply came. She could make children from a shower of rain if she so desired. Jerry looked back at the Madonna. All but the last vestige of light had been extinguished in her. The vast body threw out a tendril of saffron flame which caught the cascade of water and threw dancing patterns on the wall. Then it was still. When Jerry looked back for the mother and the child, they had gone. Indeed, all the women had gone but one. It was the girl who had first appeared to him. The smile she'd worn was on her face again, as she sat across the room from him, her legs splayed. He gazed at the place between them, and then back at her face. What are you afraid of? She asked. I'm not afraid. Then why don't you come to me? He stood up and crossed the chamber to where she sat. Behind him the water still slapped and ran on the tiles, and behind the fountains the Madonna murmured in her flesh. He was not intimidated by her presence. The likes of him was surely beneath the notice of such a creature. If she saw him at all, she doubtless thought him ridiculous. Jesus, he was ridiculous even to himself. He had neither hope nor dignity left to lose. Tomorrow all this would be a dream. The water, the children, the beauty who even now stood up to embrace him. Tomorrow he would think he had died for a day and visited a shower house for angels. For now, he would make what he could of the opportunity. After they had made love, he and the smiling girl, when he tried to recall the specifics of the act, he could not be certain that they had performed at all. Only the vaguest memories remained to him, and they were not of her kisses, or of how they coupled, but of a dribble of milk from her breast, and the way she murmured, "Never, never," as they had intertwined. When they were done, she was indifferent. There were no more words, no more smiles. She just left him alone in the drizzle of the chamber. He buttoned up his soiled trousers and left the Madonna to her fecundity. A short corridor led out of the shower room and into the large pool. It was, as he had vaguely registered when they had brought him into the presence of the Madonna, brimming. Her children played in the radiant water, their forms multitudinous. The women were nowhere to be seen, but the door to the other corridor stood open. He walked through it, and had taken no more than half a dozen steps before it slid close behind him. Now, all too late, Ezra Garvey knew that returning to the pools, even for an act of intimidation, which he had traditionally enjoyed, had been an error. It had reopened a wound in him which he had hoped near to healing, and it had brought memories of his second visit there, of the women, and what they had displayed to him, memories which he had sought to clarify until he began to grasp their true nature, closer to the surface. They had drugged him somehow, hadn't they? And then, when he was weak and had lost all sense of propriety, they had exploited him for their entertainment. They had suckled him like a child and made him their plaything. The memories of that merely perplexed him, but there were others too deep to be distinguished quite, which appalled, of some inner chamber, and of water falling in a curtain, of a darkness that was terrible, and a luminescence more terrible still. The time had come, he knew, to trample these dreams underfoot, and be done with such bafflement. He was a man who forgot neither favours done nor favours owed. A little before 11, he had two telephone conversations to call some of those favours in. Whatever lived at Leopold Road Pools would prosper there no longer. Satisfied with his night's manoeuvres, he went upstairs to bed. He had drunk the best part of a bottle of schnapps since returning from the incident with Colquhoun, chilled and uneasy. Now the spirit in his system caught up with him. His limbs felt heavy, his head heavier still. He did not even concern himself to undress, but lay down on his double bed for a few minutes to allow his senses to clear. When he next woke, it was 1:30 a.m. He sat up. His belly was cavorting again. Indeed, his whole body seemed to be traumatized. He had seldom been ill in his 50-odd years. Success had kept ailments at bay, but now he felt terrible. He had a headache which was near to blinding. He stumbled from his bedroom down to the kitchen, more by aid of touch than sight. There he poured himself a glass of milk, sat down at the table and put it to his lips. He did not drink, however. His gaze had alighted on the hand that held his glass. He stared at it through a fog of pain. It didn't seem to be his hand. It was too fine, too smooth. He put the glass down, trembling, but it tipped over, the milk pooling on the teak tabletop and running off onto the floor. He got to his feet, the sound of the milk on the kitchen tiles awaking curious thoughts, and moved unsteadily through to his study. He needed to be with somebody. Anyone would do. He picked up his telephone book and tried to make sense of the scrawlings on each page, but the numbers would not come clear. His panic was growing. Was this insanity? The delusion of his transformed hand? The unnatural sensations which were running through his body? He reached to unbutton his shirt, and in doing so his hand brushed another delusion, more absurd than the first. Fingers unwilling, he tore at the shirt, telling himself over and over again that none of this was possible. But the evidence was plain. He touched a body which was no longer his. There were still signs that the flesh and bone belonged to him, an appendix scar in his lower abdomen, a birthmark beneath his arm, but the substance of his body had been teased, was being teased still, even as he watched, into shapes that shamed him. He clawed at the forms that disfigured his torso as if they might dissolve beneath his assault, but they merely bled. In his time, Ezra Garvey had suffered much, almost all his suffering self-inflicted. He had undergone periods of imprisonment, come close to serious physical wounding, had endured the deceptions of beautiful women, but those torments were nothing beside the anguish he felt now. He was not himself. His body had been taken from him while he slept, and this changeling left in its place. The horror of it shattered his self-esteem and left his sanity teetering. Unable to hold back the tears, he began to pull at the belt of his trousers. "Please, God," he babbled, "please, God, let me be whole still." He could barely see for the tears. He wiped them away and peered at his groin, seeing what deformities were in progress there. He roared until the windows rattled. Garvey was not a man for prevarications. Deeds, he knew, were not best served by debate. He wasn't sure how this treatise on transformation had been written into his system, and he didn't much care. All he could think of was how many deaths of shame he would die if this vile condition ever saw the light of day. He returned into the kitchen, selecting a large meat knife from the drawer, then adjusted his clothing and left the house. His tears had dried, they were wasted now, and he was not a wasteful man. He drove through the empty city down to the river and across Blackfriars Bridge. There he parked and walked down to the water's edge. The Thames were high and fast tonight. The tops of the waters were whipping white. Only now, having come so far without examining his intentions too closely, did fear of extinction give him pause. He was a wealthy and influential man. Were there not other routes out of this ordeal, other than the one he had come headlong to? Pill peddlers who could reverse the lunacy that had seized his cells, surgeons who might slice off the offending parts and knit his lost self back together again. But how long would such solutions last? Sooner or later the process would begin again. He knew it. He was beyond help. A gust of wind blew spume up off the water. It rained against his face, and the sensation finally broke the seal on his forgetfulness. At last he remembered it all. The shower room, the spouts from the severed pipes beating on the floor, the heat, the women laughing and applauding. And finally, the thing that lived behind the water wall, a creature that was worse than any nightmare of womanhood his grieving mind had dredged up. He had fucked there, in the presence of that behemoth, and in the fury of the act, when he had momentarily forgotten himself, the bitches had worked this rapture upon him. No use for regrets. What was done was done. At least he had made provisions for the destruction of their lair. Now he would undo by self-surgery what they had contrived by magic, and so at least deny them sight of their handiwork. The wind was cold, but his blood was hot. It came gushingly as he slashed at his body. The Thames received the libation with enthusiasm. It lapped at his feet. It whipped itself into eddies. He had not finished the job, however, when the loss of blood overcame him. No matter, he thought, as his knees buckled, and he toppled into the water. No one will know me now but fishes. The prayer he offered up as the river closed over him was that death not be a woman. Long before Garvey had woken in the night and discovered his body in rebellion, Jerry had left the pools, got into his car, and attempted to drive home. He had not been the equal of that simple task, however. His eyes were bleary, his sense of direction confused. After a near accident at an intersection, he parked the car and began to walk back to the flat. His memories of what had just happened to him were by no means clear, though the events were mere hours solid. His head was full of strange associations. He walked in the solid world, but half dreaming. It was the sight of Chanderman and Fryer waiting for him in the bedroom of his flat that slapped him back into reality. He did not wait for them to greet him, but turned and ran. They had emptied his stock of spirits as they lay in ambush, and were slow to respond. He was down the stairs and gone for the house before they could give chase. He walked to Carol's. She was not in. He didn't mind waiting. He sat on the front steps of her home for half an hour, and when the tenant of the top-floor flat arrived, talked his way into the comparative warmth of the house itself, and kept vigil on the stairs. There he fell to dozing and retraced his steps over the route he'd come, back to the intersection where he'd abandoned the car. A crowd of people were passing the place. "Where are you going?" he asked them. "To see the yachts," they replied. "What yachts are those?" He wanted to know, but they were already drifting away, chattering. He walked on a while. The sky was dark, but the streets were illuminated nevertheless by a wash of blue and shadowless light. Just as he was about to come within sight of the pools, he heard a splashing sound and, turning a corner, discovered that the tide was coming up in Leopold Street. What sea was this? He inquired of the gulls overhead, for the salt tang in the air declared that these waters were ocean, not river. Did it matter what sea it was? They returned. Weren't all seas one sea, finally? He stood and watched the wavelets creeping across the tarmac. Their advance, though gentle, overturned lampposts, and so swiftly eroded the foundations of the buildings that they fell, silently, beneath the glacial tide. Soon the waves were around his feet. Fishes, tiny darts of silver, moved in the water. "Jerry?" Carol was on the stairs, staring at him. "What the hell's happened to you?" "I could have drowned," he said. He told her about the trap Garvey had set at Leopold Road and how he'd been beaten up, then of the thug's presence at his own house. She offered cool sympathy. He said nothing about the chase through the spiral, or the women, or the something that he'd seen in the shower room. He couldn't have articulated it, even if he'd wanted to. Every hour that passed since he'd left the pool, he was less certain of having seen anything there at all. "Do you want to stay here?" she asked him when he'd finished his account. "I thought you'd never ask." "You better have a bath. Are you sure they didn't break any bones?" "I think I'd feel it by now if they had." No broken bones, perhaps, but he had not escaped unmarked. His torso was a patchwork of ripening bruises, and he ached from head to toe. When, after half an hour of soaking, he got out of the bath and surveyed himself in the mirror, His body seemed to be puffed up by the beating, the skin on his chest tender and tight. He was not a pretty sight. "Tomorrow you must go to the police," Carol told him later as they lay side by side, "and have this bastard Garvey arrested." "I suppose so," he said. She leaned over him. His face was bland with fatigue. She kissed him lightly. "I'd like to love you," she said. He did not look at her. "Why do you make it so difficult?" "Do I?" he said, his eyelids drooping. She wanted to slide her hand beneath the bathrobe he was still wearing. She had never quite understood his coyness, but it charmed her, and caress him. But there was a certain insularity in the way he lay that signalled his wish to be left untouched, and she respected it. "I'll turn out the light," she said, but he was already asleep. The tide was not kind to Ezra Garvey. It picked up his body and played with it back and forth a while, picking at it like a replete diner, toying with food he had no appetite for. It carried the corpse a mile downstream, and then, tired of its burden, the current relegated it to the slower water near the banks. And there, abreast of Battersea, it became snagged in a mooring rope. The tide went out. Garvey did not. As the water level dropped, he remained depending from the rope, his bloodless bulk revealing inch by inch as the tide left him, and the dawn came looking. By 8 o'clock, he had gained more than morning as an audience. Jerry woke to the sound of the shower running in the adjacent bathroom. The bedroom curtains were still drawn across. Only a fine dart of light found its way down to where he lay. He rolled over to bury his head in the pillow where the light wouldn't disturb him, but his brain, once stirred, began to whirl. He had a difficult day ahead in which he would have to make some account of recent events to the police. There would be questions asked, and some of them might prove uncomfortable. The sooner he thought his story through, the more watertight it would be. He rolled over and threw off the sheet. His first thought, as he looked down at himself, was that he had not truly woken yet, but still had his face buried in pillow, and was merely dreaming this waking. Dreaming, too, the body he inhabited, with its budding breasts and its soft belly. This was not his body. His was of the other sex. He tried to shake himself awake, but there was nowhere to wake to. He was here. This transformed anatomy was his. Its slit, its smoothness, its strange weight, all his. In the hour since midnight, he had been unknitted and remade in another image. From next door, the sound of the shower brought the Madonna back into his head, brought the woman, too, who had coaxed him into her and whispered as he frowned and thrust, "Never, never," telling him, though he couldn't know it, that this coupling was his last as a man. They had conspired, woman and Madonna, to work this wonder upon him, and wasn't it the finest failure of his life that he could not even hold on to his own sex, that maleness itself, like wealth and influence, was promised, then snatched away again. He got up off the bed, turning his hands over to admire their newfound fineness, running his palms across his breasts. He was not afraid, nor was he jubilant. He accepted this fait accompli as a baby accepts its condition, having no sense of what good or bad it might bring. Perhaps there were more enchantments where this had come from. If so, he would go back to the pools and find them for himself, follow the spiral into its hot heart, and debate mysteries with the Madonna. There were miracles in the world, forces that could turn flesh inside out without drawing blood, that could topple the tyranny of the real and make play in its rubble. Next door, the shower continued to run. He went to the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar, and peered in. Though the shower was on, Carol was not under it. She was sitting on the side of the bath, her hands pressed over her face. She heard him at the door. Her body shook. She did not look up. "I saw," she said. Her voice was guttural, thick with barely suppressed abhorrence. "Am I going mad?" "No." "Then what's happening?" "I don't know," he replied simply. "Is it so terrible?" "Vile," she said. "Revolting. I don't want to look at you. You hear me? I don't want to see." He didn't attempt to argue. She didn't want to know him, and that was her prerogative. He slipped through into the bedroom, dressed in his stale and dirty clothes, and headed back to the pool. He went unnoticed, or rather, if anybody along his route noted a strangeness in their fellow pedestrian, a disparity between the clothes worn and the body that wore them, they looked the other way, unwilling to tackle such a problem at such an hour, and sober. When he arrived at Leopold Road, there were several men on the steps. They were talking, though he didn't know it, of imminent demolition. Jerry lingered in the doorway of a shop across the road from the pools until the trio departed, and then made his way to the front door. He feared that they might have changed the lock, but they hadn't. He got in easily and closed the door behind him. He had not bought a torch, but when he plunged into the labyrinth, he trusted to his instinct, and it did not forsake him. After a few minutes of exploration in the benighted corridors, he stumbled across the jacket which he had discarded the previous day. A few turns beyond, he came into the chamber where the laughing girl had found him. There was a hint of daylight here, from the pool beyond. All but the last vestiges of that luminescence that had first led him here had gone. He hurried on through the chamber, his hopes sinking. The water still brimmed in the pool, but almost all its lights had flickered out. He studied the broth. There was no movement in its depths. They had gone. The mothers, the children, and, no doubt, the first, the Madonna. He walked through to the shower room. She had indeed left. Furthermore, the chamber had been destroyed, as if in a fit of pique. The tiles had been torn from the walls, the pipes ripped from the plasterwork and melted in the Madonna's heat. Here and there he saw splashes of blood. Turning his back on the wreckage, he returned to the pool, wondering if it had been his invasion that had frightened them from this makeshift temple. Whatever the reason, the witches had gone, and he, their creature, was left to fend for himself, deprived of their mysteries. He wandered along the edge of the pool, despairing. The surface of the water was not quite calm. A circle of ripples had awoken in it, and was growing by the heartbeat. He stared at the eddy as it gained momentum, flinging its arms out across the pool. The water level had suddenly begun to drop. The eddy was rapidly becoming a whirlpool. The water foamed about it. Some trap had been opened in the bottom of the pool, and the waters were draining away. Was this where the Madonna had fled? He'd rushed back to the far end of the pool and examined the tiles. Yes! She had left a trail of fluid behind her as she crept out of her shrine to the safety of the pool. And if this was where she had gone, would they not all have followed? Where the waters were draining to, he had no way of knowing. To the sewers, maybe, then to the river, and finally out to the sea. To death by drowning, to the extinction of magic, or by some secret channel, down into the earth, to some sanctuary safe from inquiry, where rapture was not forbidden. The water was rapidly becoming frenzied as suction slipped it away. The vortex whirled and foamed and spat. He studied the shape it described. A spiral, of course, elegant and inevitable. The waters were sinking fast now. The splashing had mounted to a roar. Very soon it would all be gone, the door to another world sealed up and lost. He had no choice. He leapt. The circling undertow snatched at him immediately. He barely had time to draw breath before he was sucked beneath the surface and dragged round and round, down and down. He felt himself buffeted against the floor of the pool, then somersaulted as he was pulled inexorably closer to the exit. He opened his eyes. Even as he did so, the current dragged him to the brink and over. The stream took him in its custody and flung him back and forth in its fury. There was light ahead. How far it lay he couldn't calculate, but what did it matter? If he drowned before he reached that place and ended this journey dead, so what? Death was no more certain than the dreams of masculinity he'd lived these years. Terms of description fit only to be turned up and over and inside out. The earth was bright, wasn't it? And probably full of stars. He opened his mouth and shouted into the whirlpool as the light grew and grew. An anthem in praise of paradox. And now, included here for your amusement and enjoyment, a little section that we will simply call Boop. Jerry's bribe at the Boop. This was a lie. Jerry had been over the building the previous August, courtesy of a contract in... Christ. Off to a good start. Boop. He finished the heavy boop. He tried the single boop. Jerry quickly rooted around. Boop. The fitful daylight that fell through the mildewed panes of the skylights along the corridor was blue-grey. The light, and that which fell upon vying... Oh, my God. Boop. Oh, no, bollocks. Oh, no. Don't do that. Oh, gosh. Right, where are we now? The exploration constantly brought to a halt as he discovered some new facility. Boop! Lead on, he said, and Jerry did just that, through the route to the pools. Boop! Perhaps the department engineers warmed the heating system through once in a while to keep it warm. Fucking balls. Yes, warm the heating system through to keep it in balls. Christ. Perhaps the department in... Boop! Perhaps Garvey had heard the voices. Balls. Boop! Garvey froze. You hear that? He said. There's somebody in here. His voice had suddenly... Oh, okay. Boop! Torchlight lit the fright on his face. It was only the... balls. It was only the balls. Boop! There's no way in. There's no need to blind me, Garvin said. Fucking hell. Boop! Damn, said Garvey. His regret? Damn, said Garvey. His regret quite genuine. Right. Boop! He looked back at Jerry. All tight, he said. No, that's clearly a typo. Boop! He answered her declarations of commitment as best he could, and maintained a... Oh dear. Boop! Oh, barking dog. Drinky! Boop! All his professional life, whether in or out of prison, he had needed to watch for the God. He needed to watch for the assassin at his back. Oh. Boop! And groin. His crucifix was glued to his breastbone with perseration. Balls. Boop! Clammy and ingratiating as it pressed himself. No. Boop! Clammy and ingratiating as it pressed himself. Oh, no, bollocks, Greg. Come on, read the words. Say the words with your face. Say the words that are on the page with your face into the microphone. That's what you're supposed to do. Right. Shit. The air here. Boop. The air here was much warmer than anywhere else in the building. Following the girl to the end before making another left. Boop. Oh, no, my mistake. Boop. He was relieved to see the chase finished here. No. Boop. But in its 4.5 decades... Oh, no. Boop. But in his 4.5 decades of life, Garvey's eyes had never seen such a creature. It's like... Oh, no. Bollocks. No. Boop. But in it... belonged to his narrow... Oh. Boop. Drinky. Right. Boop. She shrugged. She was just smiling. Oh. Typo. Boop. Come back to the flat. I don't want you to. Oh, fuck. Shit. Boop. It was open. The lock had been... Bollocks. Sorry. Boop. It was open. The lock had been unceremoniously forced. The wood of the door... Door jamb? The wood of the door jamb splintered. Right, yeah, no, door jamb. Yeah, that's where it's the fucking thing they put a door in. Okay. Right. Boop. He stood in the middle of the turmoil and shook, while Carol went from room to room, finding the same through... Oh. Boop. They made a perfunctory attempt to restore the... Oh, bollocks. Boop. There was no making... Boop. She frowned beneath him, his... Oh, bollocks. Boop. She told him again to stop, this time with real fury. But he just thrust harder, the way she'd asked him to. Oh, fucking bollocks. Boop. She told him to stop. What the fuck? Boop. She began to fight, raking at the back with her neck. Boop. He could retire to the study, sit on his leather-faced... Oh, fucking bollocks. His leather-faced chair. Texas Chainsaw Chair Massacre. Right, hold on. Boop. He was not a man to kowtow to such ambiguity. Fucking hell, kowtow to such ambiguities without argument. Jesus Christ, Clive. Do us a favour, mate. Boop. It had been born... Boop. As he focused on it, his outline seemed to waver. Train. Boo! Fucking train. Trainson. Bollocks. It's 5:30 in the morning, all the trains are going to start now. It's either a very long train or several trains at once. Fucking hell. There we go. Boop! With the first light of dawn came the conviction that today was another fucking train. Boop! It was a matter of 50 yards from the door of the car. Boop! I think that's right. Oh. Boop! Garvey responded. His breath smelt of last week's cigar ash. Train! Jerry knew that if he tried to shug off... Oh my God. Shug? Boop! Jerry knew that if he tried to shug off Garvey, the old ones would be pissed. Right. Then it'll have to wait, the other replied, scarcely relaxing his grip. Jerry's eye left... Boop! Garvey's eye... Balls, train. Boop! Again, said Garvin. Balls, said Greg. Boop! He began to... Boop! He nodded. It was indeed the likeliest route for Colquhoun. Bollocks! They mean to drown me, he thought. Oh dear, sorry. Boop! He knew indisputably that this creature was female, though it remembered... God. Boop! Hearing footballs behind him. Footballs? Typo! Boop! Behind him he heard... Boop! A girl gave a... Boop! She needs no husband, the reply came. She can make children from a shower of rain if she so desired. No, that was bad. Boop! She was... Boop! It was, as he had vaguely... Boop! Now, all too late, Ezra Garvey knew that returning to the pools, even for an act of intimidation, which he had traditionally enjoyed, had been an error. It had reopened a wound in him, which he had hoped near to healing, and it had brought memories of his second visit there, of the women and what they had displayed to him. Memories which he had sought to clarify until he began to grasp their true nature, closer to the surface. That whole thing was crap. Boop! It had reopened a wound in him, which he had hoped near to healing, and it had brought memories of his second visit there, of the women and what they had done to... Oh, fucking hell, Greg. Boop! They had drugged him somehow, hadn't they? And then, somehow, when he was weak and had lost all sense of propriety, they had exploited him for their plaything. They had suckled him like a child and made him their plaything. No, bollocks. Wow, okay. Yeah, maybe I can't do this anymore. All right, one more try. Now, all too late, Ezra Garvey knew that... Oh, no, I've done that bit. Boop! His torments were nothing... bollocks. Boop! Were there not other mutes out of this ordeal? A what? What? Roots. Okay. Boop! The wind was hot. Fuck. Boop! It whipped himself. Boop! After a near accident at an intersection, he parked the car. The car? Is that what he did, Greg? Did he park the car and begin to walk back to the glat? For fuck's sake. Boop! After a near accident at an intersection. He walked in the sordid world, but... Boop! Tomorrow you must go to the police, Carol told him as they lay side by side, and have this bastard Garvey addressed. Have him addressed. Boop! Train. Fucking train. Boop! Became snagged in a mooring rope. Fuck. A mooring rope. Boop! Running his hands over. Boop! He got up off the bed. After a few minutes... Excuse me. Boop!